Welcome to Testable Faith. I'm Ken Samples. Today I'm joined by scholar community member and visiting scholar Joe Bergeron, MD. He is a medical doctor. He has written about the crucifixion of Christ, about the person of Christ. Joe, welcome to our program.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
I'd like to talk with you a bit about Jesus. There is a viewpoint that has come out from skeptics called Jesus mythicism, that maybe Jesus didn't exist at all. I sometimes wonder, and I'm not trying to question the integrity of the skeptic, but I sometimes think that if they don't have to open up the Bible, they don't have to give consideration to Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection, then they don't have to face some of the evidence. But what would you say to someone who said, you know, Joe, how do we know Jesus existed? Is there any evidence other than the Gospels, other than the New Testament?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, first point is, among historical scholars, and a lot of people may raise a disagreement. Usually they're repeating something they heard somebody else say. But people that do due diligence and study history, even whether they're Christian or not, will accept that Jesus was an actual historical figure and that he had a profound effect on his disciples. That doesn't get us to the Gospels, but it gets us to an acceptance and understanding that he was an actual historical figure. I was giving a lecture at a large university, and a professor of philosophy, and he said he was a Christian, identified that way, but he asked this question, Jesus lived and whatever happened, and then people wrote about his life 30 years later.
Right.
How do we know it didn't change over time? And the answer to that is that, nothing happened in a vacuum. Jesus had a very public execution, a very public trial before Pilate and open before the public. And then, so this was all known by everybody in the city at that time. That was the practice of Roman crucifixion. It was, they had vigorous belief in crucifixion as a deterrent, and they used it, extensively as a deterrent. So he would have been crucified, in a very public place for everyone to see. The thing about how do we know that Jesus existed, you don't have to have the Bible to know Jesus existed. You don't even have to know the Bible. You don't have to have the Bible to know that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
We have that. Publius Tacitus was a Roman senator and a diplomat. He wrote in his history, it's called the Annals, in about AD 116, he wrote about crucifixion, or the crucifixion of Jesus. He wrote about Jesus and his followers, who he named as Christians, and how that Jesus had been crucified by Pontius Pilate, and that his disciple had some sort of, evil superstition, almost certainly referring to the idea that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. And they were an identified minority population group in the Roman Empire by AD 64, to the point that Nero launched his first among 10 mass persecution campaigns against Christians. They would be, fed to animals in the Colosseum. They would be impaled on torches and burnt to death. So the people that were Christians in that time had a strong belief in Jesus' resurrection and would accept death rather than to say it wasn't true. But here you have the testimony of someone not a Christian, unfriendly to Christianity, but he's telling us the essentials of the account of Jesus' crucifixion. That's very strong historical evidence that Jesus existed. Not only that he was crucified, and that his followers believed in his resurrection to the point that they would accept death rather than to say it didn't happen. in medicine, if you're my patient and I think you're acutely ill and you need to be seen by a physician other than myself, I need to transfer care. But if I think your condition is urgent, then I have to do what's called a warm handoff in medicine. I have to be talking face-to-face or on the phone with another physician and say, I'm sending you this patient. This is what I think is going on. He needs urgent care, and this is what I think is happening. And so there's a direct transmission. So there's no loss of information. There is a direct transmission. And we see that in the early part of early Christianity, where, again, none of this occurred in a vacuum. We have people on the scene who saw and wrote about what they saw. And I think, to me, one of the more compelling ones is Luke's gospel.
Right.
Luke was a physician. I'll salute the physician in the Bible.
Yes.
He contributed the largest volume of text to the New Testament. 27% is attributed to Luke. And Luke and Acts.
Luke and Acts is a combination.
Yeah, 2 volumes said it was considered in that time. And Luke was a travel companion with the Apostle Paul. So he traveled with Paul. He also had occasion to meet other people that knew Jesus and saw Jesus.
Yeah.
And he addressed his writing to a Roman official named Theophilus, who we don't know who that is. It's lost to time. But the case has been made, and I think a compelling one, that Theophilus was probably some kind of Roman dignitary because, Paul was on trial. In Acts chapter 25, they were going to send him to Jerusalem to be tried. He would have, been found guilty and probably executed at that point. But he appealed to Caesar. He was a Roman citizen. Yeah. He said, I want to go to trial before Caesar. That's scary by itself.
Yeah.
But to go on trial before the Roman Supreme Court, he would have needed to have a narrative summary of his accusations and his defense. And some people believe, and I think accurately so, that Luke's writing, Luke is a physician, being more educated than most, understanding the Gentile perspective, prepared a submission of Luke and Acts to the Roman Supreme Court. There's actually some literary references that say Paul was acquitted, but then later recalled to Rome and executed. And so the telling thing there is that in Luke chapter 1, in his opening statements, he addresses Theophilus and he says, many people have undertaken to write about what the things that happened among us. I've been aware of these things from the very beginning.
Yeah.
I collected these things. I put them in chronological order so that you would know exactly what happened. Yeah. Imagine fabricating a story to the Roman Supreme Court. Imagine what would happen to you if you did that. And the stakes were high because, in Rome you couldn't just start a religion.
Yeah.
Judaism was a sanctioned religion. Christianity was not. And if Luke could make the case that Christianity was the extension of Judaism, then it would relieve the persecution that some of the Christians were experiencing, let alone hopefully get acquittal for his friend the Apostle Paul. So the stakes were very high. Yeah. So he did a rigorous job to present an accurate depiction of the Gospels and what happened after the Gospels in the book of Acts. So we see that, it's interesting. None of the Gospels describe the siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was razed to the ground in AD 70.
Yes.
Josephus said anyone who had been to the city before wouldn't have known where it was.
Wow.
So it's maybe a little bit hyperbole, but you can understand it's intrinsic or empiric evidence within the Gospels themselves that they were written before AD 70. And you have a rich history of scribal practices, of people that were in place to know whether any of the Gospels had been changed in any way. So, we can reasonably understand that those things were handed down accurately. Now, some people say, you've probably heard this, or many people may have heard, The texts were corrupted. There's a lot of mistakes that have gone through time. How do we know that what we have is the same thing as what was written by the gospel authors? And that really, Bart Ehrman wrote the book Misquoting Jesus,
yes,
and that had some commercial success for him.
Former conservative Christian, fell
Yes.
away from the faith, became a skeptic.
Yeah, well, if you want to abandon your faith, why just go get a job and go do that. But leave people alone. Why do you want to do that? But that's another point. But what he did was look at that, and there have been thousands. One source I read 40,000 textual errors in ancient manuscripts.
Yes,
but we have 5,700 ancient manuscripts, and what Ehrman did was cherry pick information and present something that for most of us we wouldn't have the proper tools to vet whether what he's saying is actual or not. And I would point to Daniel Wallace. Daniel Wallace was the chief translator of the New English Translation. He's at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's an expert in textual criticism. And I communicated with him by email and reference him in my book. Of course, there were a lot of textual errors. Over 2/3 of them are spelling errors.
yeah, epsilon iota rather than iota epsilon.
I guess. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they didn't cross the T right. But it would be things like that, or word swapping, or pronunciation issues. And he, in his writing, he said about 1% would be actual, errors of transmission. And I emailed him about that, and he emailed me back, and he said, actually, it's far less than 1%. And the main point of that whole discussion is that none of the gospel narratives have been changed by textual errors. And the take-home point for everybody listening, none of this is a secret.
Yeah.
None of this is a secret now exposed by Bart Ehrman. No, that's not true. You can pick up, if you have a reference Bible, all textual discrepancies are in footnotes, all of them. The New English Translation I like because it's extremely well footnoted, for example. But none of this stuff, nobody's trying to keep this a mystery. Any kind of discrepancy, differences in translation, all that stuff is well known and well documented.
Right.
We have handed down to us accurate descriptions of eyewitness accounts by people that knew Jesus best, attributed to the authors that the way it's said in our Bibles, it's attributed.
And what's interesting is I've heard Wallace say that, again, none of these textual challenges affect any area of Christian doctrine or truth claims. Interestingly enough as well, even Bart Ehrman believes Jesus existed. He's gone against this Jesus mythicism. So even he would say, I was thinking of a quotation from the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, where he said that Jesus' death is as well known a fact as we have in ancient history. So
Yes.
That's very powerful.
It's very powerful. And as I said at the beginning, we don't need the Bible to know what happened to Jesus.
I notice in your book you take up some of these Roman historians, Greeks, even Jewish scholars. So we're talking Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, Josephus. When I've looked at these and kind of taken the content of all of them, they have a message that's very consistent with the Bible, that Jesus was from Galilee, that he was a great teacher, that he performed miracles, or his disciples thought he did. He was crucified, and his followers believed that he had been raised from the dead. And this superstition has come all the way to Rome.
Yes.
I mean, that's very much in keeping with what we read in the Gospels themselves.
Yes, it's very compelling, and you think, but isn't that really, when Jesus gave the Great Commission in Luke chapter 24, it was basically three things. He said, you've read the prophets, and you know what they said about the Messiah, and you've seen me. Now go tell people what you've seen.
Yeah.
So Yeah, so that was their modus operandi.
Yeah.
Then to go about and say, we are eyewitnesses. This is what the Bible says about the coming Messiah. This is what we saw. We saw him.
Joe, I was reading your book, and I noticed you spend a lot of time looking at not only the crucifixion, but you're very interested in the historical evidence, the historical data. What motivates that on your part as a person who has studied medicine?
Well, in my book, I approached writing the book. The book is based on 2 peer-reviewed academic articles, one in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine, the second in the Irish Theological Quarterly. And as I began to approach putting those in a book format for a wider readership, just going through the logical thoughts of, I prepared the book really as I would prepare a summary for courtroom deposition.
Wow.
And part of that is, I've done medical legal work, and part of that is to set the stage of what was happening. In an injury, for example, we'd say how someone was injured and what were the events there.
You're given a context.
A context, yeah. So in talking about Jesus, well, part of that is, how do we know that we really have an accurate story about Jesus? So it was imperative in setting the framework or the foundation for discussing the death and resurrection of Jesus that I approach the topic or the question of, do we really have an accurate record and historical narrative about Jesus Christ to begin with?
Very good. If you'd like to know more about our guest, Dr. Joe Bergeron, go to reasons.org, type in his name. He's written blog articles, and many things are available to you. Thank you.